Okay, good morning to everyone. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. Special thanks to Tzivi for inviting me to participate. What I want to deal with is the last issue that Professor Brody mentioned, the two opinions that we had in the Geonim, the one opinion that's presented more clearly in source number 4 that Professor Brody presented and was quoted briefly in source number 3 and then rejected. In those two approaches, one approach came along and said, when I'm handling somebody else's property, I can do as I do with my own property, and that opinion was rejected. And he said, no, what you do with your own, you can't take the same approach as when you're handling somebody else's property. When you're handling somebody else's property, you have to be more strict, and by more strict, what that approach meant was taking less risks. So what I want to deal with is both seeing how each approach deals with the other proofs and sources that the other approach brings, and also seeing how each approach deals with the challenges that it faces. Because if, for example, we take the more conservative approach of minimizing risk, on the one hand, we are minimizing risk, but we're also minimizing the chance for profit. And also, by the more conservative approach, everything works well as long as everything's normal, but you might encounter certain situations that it's not safe versus risk, but more complicated situations, which we'll discuss ahead. On the other hand, the more flexible approach, which says do as you do with your own, it gives you more flexibility, it gives you more of a chance for profit. But the question is, as we know, some people with their own money can be actually cross the boundary between legitimate risk and becoming reckless. And the question is, where does that approach put a stop to its do as you do with your own? What are the limits to doing with it as you do with your own? So let's go first of all into the source that Professor Brody presented. That's source number 1 in the pages, and here the opinion was quoted says, and some said that since he was willing to do the same with his own property, he is not liable. In other words, since he was willing to sell on credit in that case, and he took the same risk with his own property, he's not liable if at the end the person owning the money defaulted on the debt. But he rejects this opinion. The Gaon rejects this opinion. He says, "In this saying is nothing, for it is stated clearly if he," and in the source, which appears in the Jerusalem Talmud and also in the Tosefta, it's referring to a Bailey, placed it where he placed his own. If it is a place proper for safekeeping, he is exempt. And if not, he is liable. That's the source I brought in source number 2, which is really dealing with somebody who was given to him for safeguarding. And there it says that it seems to indicate that the fact that he placed it where he placed his own is irrelevant, because and the only thing that matters is an objective criteria of if it is a place that is proper for safekeeping. If you look at Maimonides in source number 3, where he also quotes this ruling, he seems to have the same interpretation of this source, because after stating this ruling, he adds a line. He says, that's the line in bold at the end of source number 3, he says, with what belongs to him he is permitted, but not with what belongs to others. In other words, the fact that you placed your own property in that same location, that doesn't mean anything. We have to objectively check if where you kept it is a good place or not. And the fact that you put your own thing there, that doesn't indicate anything. That seems to be the indication of Maimonides. Now, we could have made a difference, a very simple distinction between the two cases. I didn't see anybody who clearly makes this distinction, but I would have thought that there's a big distinction between when it was given over for safeguarding, which is the case discussed in the Tosefta and in the Jerusalem Talmud, and there his job really is just to preserve it. So by there you could say the fact that he's willing to take a risk with his own, he can't do that with somebody else's property. If you're guarding somebody else's property, you have to make sure you put it in the best possible place. But in the case that was discussed in the Responsibly of the Gaonim, it wasn't given to him for safeguarding, it was given to him for business. If he's selling for business, he needs to make a profit. If he's limiting himself only to people who can pay in cash, obviously his volume of business and his chance for profit is going to go down. So I could have easily rejected this source and said it's not relevant to a case where somebody's where somebody was giving when it was given over to him to do business, in which case we expect him to take more risks, so then he'll be able to take greater profit. So if you look, I found at least a hint that this distinction was rejected by the Rif in source number 4, who also is of the opinion, also addressing this issue of selling on credit, a little after the period of the Gonim, and he also says that it's very strictly that you're not allowed to sell on credit without the explicit permission of the partner, the person who gave you over his money. And there, he says there, in the middle, after very clearly saying that it's recklessness and he should not sell on credit, he says that this is the part that I told you in bold, and he says there, and the partner should have bought less and sold only to those who pay immediately. Or I found another slightly different version of the same responsa. He said that the partner should have sold for less profit. In other words, he's indicating to two possible scenarios where he would actually gain less profit by selling only to those paying cash, either because his ability to buy initially more of the purchase more of the whatever it is, the commodities that he was dealing with is more limited because he's only dealing with buyers afterwards who will buy from cash, or he's another possibility where he might lose is because if he's selling to people who are willing to buy on credit, he could perhaps charge them more, as opposed to people who are paying in cash. He's charging them probably less than he would for somebody who's selling on credit. But we see here that despite the fact that the Rif here was aware of this potential loss in profit, he nevertheless said you're not allowed to take the risk if you did not receive the explicit permission to sell on credit. In that case, you're not allowed to take the risk. In other words, this approach sees both the cases where the money was given, the property of somebody else was given over for either for safeguarding or to do business with. Your job is mainly, first of all, primary, to limit risks, not to incur any losses, despite the fact that in the case of business, your chance for making profits go down. Nevertheless, your first obligation is to prevent damages to the other's property, and that's the way you should do. Now, how would the other approach, the approach that said, do as you do with your own, yes, go ahead and take risks. First of all, what proof can it bring for its opinion? So there's an interesting story in the Talmud. That's source number 5, which seems to exactly say this opinion that says basically do as you do with your own. Let's see here the story. In source number 5, Ravina had in his possession some wine belonging to the orphan Ravina the Little. Okay, no Patricks here, only classic names from those times, Ravina and Ravina, his nephew, his sister's son. And he had also some wine of his own, which he was about to take up to Sikara, which was another town, from what I read in the sources, and meant traveling with the wine along the river. When he came to Rav Ashi and asked him, may I carry the orphan's wine with my own, the other told him, you may go, it is not superior to your own. So it seems, the Talmud doesn't give all the details of the case here, but it seems that clearly, why did he want to travel with the wine to Sikara? Apparently the wine market there was better than where he was located. On the other hand, he was taking a certain risk by transporting the wine to this other town. You know, it might get the ship might sink, some damage, it might get stolen, robbers, etc. In other words, he's exposing this wine to certain risks. So with his own wine, it's clear that he was willing to take the risk. His only question was, if I'm taking my wine also, may I also take my nephew, who is an orphan, who I'm apparently now caring for his property, am I also allowed to take the wine and expose it to the risk and sell it there in Sikar? And the ruling was of Rav Ashi is yes, it is not superior to your own, which seems to indicate do with it as you do with your own. And indeed, we find later on a later authority, the Mordechai, who based on this says exactly this rule. He quotes here the Rashbam. I couldn't find the original source of the ruling, but this is what he says in source number 6, based on this passage in the Talmud. So too, two brothers or two partners, what one does with his own share to profit, he should do the same with his partners. And they share the losses as well. In other words, whatever he does with his own, he can do the same with his partners. If they'll profit together, they'll share the profits. If they'll incur losses, they'll share the losses. But he ends here a line, as long as he's not negligent. Okay, that's the only limitation. He can do whatever he wants as long as he's not negligent or reckless. So that seems to be a very good source for the position that says do as you do with your own. How would this position deal with the other source that we brought earlier about giving into safeguarding? That there it says, there the Tosefta said, the fact that you placed it where you placed your own does not matter. What matters is only if the place is objectively good for safekeeping. So there's a very interesting interpretation of that source by the Maharam Meir of Rothenburg, who quotes the same Tosefta, and he comes to the exact opposite conclusion of the Gaon and the Maimonides and the Rif and all the sources we quoted earlier. He comes to the exact opposite conclusion. And he comes to the conclusion, he somehow reads into the Tosefta a completely different interpretation. Just see the part that I put in bold. He says from the language, he's referring here to the Tosefta and the Jerusalem Talmud, and he says, source number 7, from the language it seems that even if he didn't properly lock it, or if he placed it at the top of his attic, which was cases there discussed earlier as cases which are not good for safeguarding, not good places to place the money, since he usually places his own there, he is exempt, since it is somewhat proper for safeguarding. In other words, what he comes out and says here is something very interesting. In other words, we have a basic objective definition for safeguarding, the best possible place that you can put it. And then we have places which are considered less secure. You shouldn't put it there. And then we have places which are totally insecure. It's complete recklessness. He divides it into 3 different levels of safeguarding. Now, regarding the middle level, which is not completely insecure, but not what we would call a Swiss bank or the best place to keep something, that, he says here, something subjective can come into play, and that is, did you put your own property there? If you put your own property there, regarding that middle tier, that's an indication that it is a good place. The fact that you were willing to place your own property there at risk, that means that it actually is a legitimate place, even though we have a better place than we thought you could have done better. But nevertheless, that sort of reduces mitigates what you did, and it gives it legitimacy. And then if it was stolen, burned down, whatever damage happened to it, you are exempt. But this would not apply if you put it in a place that is completely negligent. In other words, he interprets the Tosefta in the exact opposite way. If you placed it where you placed your own, if it's if we go back to source number 2, if you read it now, it would be like this. If he placed it where he placed his own, if it is a proper place for safekeeping, he's exempt, and if not, he's liable. In other words, he reads it, if it is somewhat proper for safekeeping, that he's exempt. Why? Because he placed his own there. In other words, the fact that he placed his own there, that makes that place, which is somewhat legitimate, gives it full legitimacy. Okay? In other words, the exact opposite of how it was interpreted by the earlier sources who rejected the viability of using the fact that you did it with your own there. Okay, so now we've completed the, so to speak, the opinion which says that do as you do with your own is a legitimate proposition. The only limitation that you have here, according to this opinion, is don't be negligent. In other words, true, this would, I'm sure implementing this would raise a lot of questions. What is the boundary between negligence and somewhat proper safekeeping, somewhat proper risks? But the very fact that you were willing to do as you do with your own, that would give a justification, provided that there wasn't clear negligence or recklessness involved, according to this opinion. Now, let's go back to the first opinion, the more conservative approach. And the challenge now that it faces, in terms of the proofs that we discussed, is the story in the Talmud about Ravina. Why? Because in that story about Ravina handling his orphan's money, his orphan's wine rather, clearly he was instructed to do as he does with his own. If he willing to take the risk and take the wine up the river to sell it in Sikara, then he could do the same with his orphan's wine. How is that justified? How can we, according to the more conservative approach that said what you do with your own is irrelevant, how would they deal with that proof? So I found two possible explanations for that passage in the Talmud, according to those of the more conservative approach. The first is a very interesting approach, a very interesting answer, which the Rosh provides in his commentary on that passage in Ketuvot, in source number 8. And he says as follows. He really turns the table on this whole story. Let's read what he says in source number 8. He says, and so, anyone who has in his possession property of orphans, he should do as instructed by the court. And he should not say on his own, I will do as I do with my own. For in this matter he has not fulfilled his obligation and will not be exempt if any loss occurs. And so too in regards to selling movables of orphans, everything should be done as the court sees fit, and what they think will be for the benefit of the orphans to hold onto them until the day of the market or to sell immediately, they should do so. In other words, what does he say? He says, really, going back to the story about Ravina with the wine of his orphans, he says the conclusion of that story is not that you should do with the wine as you do with your own. Rather, the conclusion of the story is that Ravina didn't make the decision on his own. Before he made the decision, he came to Rav Ashi. He asked, that's really what you should do. Only after he got permission of Rav Ashi, who was the head of the court, only then he was allowed to take the risk. In other words, despite the fact, we read the story, we read into Rav Ashi's ruling. He said, do as lo adif mididach, in other words, do as you do with your own. The Rosh is saying exactly the opposite. He asked. That's the main message of the story. And anytime you want to take a risk, you have to first ask. So if you're handling the property of somebody who can take care of his own, obviously you have to ask him. Since in that situation he was dealing with an orphan's property, then he had to ask permission of the court.
But
now,
maybe the orphans play another significant role, and that's in the fact that they are subject to a specific compassionate, extra compassionate.
It's a great question. Let's take it up in the question period.
Okay, all right. It could be that he's in other words, the fact that it's an orphans, but clearly he's intending for better. In other words, the other opinion would say, I know it's an orphans, but I'm trying to do the best that I can for it. Okay. But anyway, obviously, such an approach, go and ask the court, doesn't seem very practical. First of all, every time to go and run ahead and ask the court, it doesn't seem very viable. And also, who says the court will also have the answer? I mean, unless Rav Ashi is even as the head of the court, who says that he knows to calculate these risks of transporting wine and all the markets? It doesn't seem very practical. So interestingly, the Rosh's own son, the Tur, who usually in his works follows his father almost, I would say, 99% of the cases, here he limits his father's ruling severely, and he says as follows. After quoting his father's ruling, he says as follows, just see the underlined part, he says, it seems that this, in other words, he's referring to his father's ruling, the requirement to consult with the court, only refers to someone who the orphan's property is in his hands, but was not appointed to be their guardian. But an appointed guardian does not need the court and may do as he thinks. Okay, in other words, he says, and I've seen later sources which say that even though he's sort of interpreting his father's opinion, he's clearly disagreeing with him, that he says, perhaps, why, even if you say that in that case Ravina had to come and ask Rav Ashi and receive permission, perhaps it was the situation was that even though Ravina had in his possession his nephew's wine, the orphan, that was by default. Nobody appointed him to be the guardian of the property of his nephew. Just he was the closest relative, and by default he was taking care of it. That's why he did not have permission to take the risk on his own. But once you're an appointed guardian, or if we compare it to, let's say, partners, where it was given over to you, Once it was given over to you, and now you're the man in charge. Once you're the man in charge, then we go back to the rule, which is do as you do with your own. In that specific case, since he wasn't appointed, he just sort of came into the position. That's why he had to receive permission. But otherwise, once it's given over to you, if it's given over to you, that means it was your judgment is trusted. Once your judgment is trusted, then you can make the best decision as you see fit. And the best way to see if your decision, if you made the decision with your own, okay, that means that your position is justified. That's one resolution to that problem. Another resolution to that source, a slightly different resolution, is I found in Maimonides, who we said earlier was from the conservative approach, where he quotes this ruling about the story of Ravina and Ravashi. For some reason, he discusses beer, not wine. I guess the Aramaic word could be translated as wine or beer. Though personally, the story made more sense to me by wine. As soon we'll see why. And here he brings the ruling as follows. He says, one who has in his possession, source number 10, one who has in his possession beer that belongs to orphans, if he keeps it in its place until it is sold, it may sour. And if he transports it to the market, it may be lost along the way. He should do with it as he does with his own, and so too in any other similar situation. In other words, the way Maimonides brings the case, it's not that he was taking a risk by transporting the wine or the beer, but rather even by keeping it here, he was also taking a risk. Why? Because it may go sour. In other words, if he keeps it here, and here apparently there's less of a market to sell it to, he'll have to hold on to it longer. It might go sour in the meantime. If he's transporting it, he's also taking a risk, but at least he'll be able to sell it. So in this case, where each option he's faced with a risk, then in this case, Maimonides agrees, do as you do with your own. In other words, here we have an interesting limitation on the conservative approach. The conservative approach works as long as there's a clear, safer option, despite the fact that it has less profit, and there's a riskier option with potential greater profit that tells you, take the safer option. But once there is no safe option, and both options you're faced with a certain risk, then even that the conservative opinion agrees. Then the rule of do as you do with your own, in other words, deciding which risk is better to take and not, then that is a legitimate approach. Okay, I just wanted to finish with something, an interesting case that I found that sort of can demonstrate to you how sometimes a partner who, even if he's willing to do the same with his own, to do with his others is considered not legitimate. In other words, where even the opinion of the do as you do with your own would have their limits. This is an interesting case, much later on from the 19th century, by Rabbi Shvadron. And he brings the following case. He says, in source number 11, he says, I was asked regarding two partners who in their joint business stood before a concern of a great loss, and one of them, without the knowledge of his partner, gave a large sum to charity and sent money to the righteous men of that time to pray for them. Okay, in other words, he said, how are we going to get out of this? I'll send money to the righteous men, the Rebbes, perhaps, to pray for them. Afterwards, apparently, maybe it was successful. Afterwards, this partner wanted this to be considered an expense of the partnership. And the other partner does not agree to accept this as an expense of the partnership. Here he says, I put out money which profited our business. They prayed and it worked. So he says, in my humble opinion, this is Reb Shvadron now ruling on this case, it seems that since this is not something which is universal to all people, and many do not do so, in other words, many people, although apparently many do, but many people would not send the money for the prayers, he should not have done this without consulting his partner. And most certainly if his partner is one of those who are in opposition to the aforementioned rabbi, the righteous man, here is hinting to apparently to the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim. So certainly if he's of the Mitnagdim, the people who oppose the Rebbes, then certainly you cannot expect the partner to accept this as a legitimate expense. Then for sure he may not consider this to be an expense of the partnership without the consent of his partner. So we see here that even do as you do with your own can stretch your imagination, but you definitely have to put limits to it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. The third presenter is Yotam Yuri, who is a crazy philosopher and heads the Department of Management at the University of the Negev.